Lieutenant Maria Vasquez had always known she was born to lead soldiers. At 23, she commanded the respect of hardened veterans twice her age at Fort Liberty's elite Ranger training program. Her tactical scores shattered records that had stood for 15 years, and while other officers struggled with basic combat strategies, Maria orchestrated complex multi-unit operations with the precision of a general who'd commanded armies across continents. But what happened next would challenge everything she believed about justice, merit, and the price of standing up to corruption. This is the story of how the Army tried to destroy the most brilliant military mind of her generation, and how 30 years later, she would rise to become the first woman ever to earn 5 stars, proving that truth, like steel, only grows stronger under pressure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The weapons depot at Fort Liberty buzzed with anticipation on that crisp November morning in 1994. Maria stood before her graduating class of Ranger candidates, her uniform pressed to perfection, her posture radiating the quiet confidence that had made her legendary among her peers. At barely 5'4", she commanded attention not through physical presence, but through an intellectual intensity that made seasoned colonels take notes when she spoke. Her roommate and fellow officer, Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez, had watched Maria's meteoric rise with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You make the rest of us look like amateurs," Jennifer often joked, but there was truth beneath the humor. While other candidates memorized field manuals, Maria absorbed the deeper principles of warfare, studying everything from Sun Tzu's ancient strategies to modern NATO, tactical doctrines that wouldn't be taught until advanced staff college. Colonel William Hutchinson, the program's director, observed Maria with an expression that others mistook for professional interest. His steel-gray eyes followed her movements during field exercises, noting how effortlessly she coordinated artillery strikes while managing infantry advances and air support. What others saw as mentorship, Maria sensed as something darker, a scrutiny that felt more like evaluation for weakness than recognition of strength. The signs had been there for months. While Maria's performance reports glowed with superlatives, Hutchinson assigned her the most dangerous and thankless missions. When other officers received commendations for routine successes, Maria's extraordinary achievements were dismissed as adequate or meeting basic expectations. Her fellow Rangers began to whisper about the obvious disparity, but Maria pushed aside their concerns. Perhaps he was simply holding her to higher standards because he recognized her potential. During advanced tactical seminars, Maria's innovative approaches to asymmetric warfare caught the attention of Pentagon observers, who had come to evaluate the program's effectiveness. Her presentation on future combat scenarios in urban environments was so sophisticated that visiting generals requested copies for their own strategic planning departments. Major defense contractors began quietly asking about her post-graduation availability, sensing that her insights could reshape modern military doctrine. But Colonel Hutchinson's reaction to this external interest was swift and calculating. He began documenting what he termed concerning patterns in Maria's behavior, her tendency to question outdated protocols, her habit of suggesting improvements to established procedures, her natural inclination to lead rather than simply follow orders. In his private notes, later discovered during congressional investigations, he wrote, "Lieutenant Vasquez demonstrates dangerous independent thinking that could undermine unit cohesion and chain of command discipline. The academic excellence that should have guaranteed Maria's selection for advanced officer training became the very weapon used against her." Hutchinson argued to his superiors that someone who scored too highly on strategic assessments might lack the practical judgment needed for field command. Her perfect scores on leadership evaluations were reframed as evidence of an inflated ego that could prove dangerous in real combat situations. Maria's tactical innovations, which had impressed Pentagon officials, were suddenly characterized as reckless departures from proven methodologies. Her ability to inspire loyalty among her subordinates was described as potential insubordination evidence, that she might encourage others to question legitimate authority. Every strength was twisted into a perceived weakness, every achievement recontextualized as a warning sign. The final evaluation committee met in a sterile conference room lined with portraits of distinguished Fort Liberty graduates who had gone on to lead American forces in conflicts around the world. Maria sat at attention while 5 senior officers reviewed her file, their faces revealing nothing of the decision that would define the next 3 decades of her life. Colonel Hutchinson presented his case with the measured confidence of someone who had already secured the outcome. He spoke of the need for officers who could function within established systems, rather than those who might disrupt proven chains of command. The Army, he argued, required leaders who would execute orders flawlessly rather than those who might waste valuable time questioning strategic decisions made by their superiors. Lieutenant Vasquez undoubtedly possesses intellectual capabilities, Hutchinson testified, his voice carrying the authority of 22 years of military service. However, her tendency toward independent analysis and her apparent belief that her tactical assessments supersede established doctrine represent significant risks to unit effectiveness and mission success. Maria's defense felt pathetic against the weight of institutional momentum. She had no recording of her conversations with Hutchinson, no documentation of the discriminatory treatment she had experienced, and no allies in a room where military hierarchy meant everything. Her academic achievements suddenly seemed meaningless against carefully constructed narratives about her unsuitability for command positions. "I've dedicated my life to serving my country and protecting the soldiers under my command," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the formal chamber. "Every innovation I've proposed has been designed to save lives and accomplish missions more effectively." General Patricia Morrison, the committee's senior member, leaned forward with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with barely concealed skepticism. "Lieutenant Vasquez, are you suggesting that your tactical innovations are superior to strategies developed by officers with decades of combat experience?" The way the question was phrased made Maria sound arrogant, possibly delusional. Her heart sank as she realized this wasn't an evaluation. It was a predetermined conclusion wrapped in the appearance of due process. 2 days later, the verdict arrived in an official envelope delivered to Maria's quarters by military courier. Her hands remained steady as she read the formal rejection letter, each word hitting like a physical blow. "Failed to demonstrate appropriate respect for established military hierarchy. Exhibited concerning patterns of independent decision-making that could compromise unit cohesion. Effective immediately. Recommended for reassignment to administrative support functions." The Army offered her what felt like a cruel consolation prize, a position in the Pentagon's logistics department. She could continue her military career, but she would never command troops in the field. The irony was devastating. The woman deemed unfit to lead soldiers would be responsible for managing the supply chains that kept those same soldiers alive. That night, Maria made a decision that would define the next 30 years of her military service. She accepted the Pentagon assignment, not out of gratitude, but out of strategy. If the Army wanted to bury her potential, she would let them believe they had succeeded. But she would never stop learning, never stop growing, and never stop preparing for the moment when her country would need the skills they had rejected. The next morning, she packed her belongings and prepared to leave Fort Liberty forever. Her dreams of leading soldiers into battle had been systematically destroyed, but something harder and more dangerous had taken their place, an unshakable conviction that merit would eventually triumph over politics, and that those who had underestimated her would one day discover the magnitude of their mistake. 3 months into her Pentagon assignment, Maria had settled into a routine that felt like professional purgatory. Her cubicle in the logistics wing overlooked a parking lot rather than training fields, and her days were filled with spreadsheets instead of strategic planning. But she approached even this mundane work with the same precision that had made her legendary at Fort Liberty, quickly identifying inefficiencies in supply chain management that had cost the military millions of dollars annually. Her supervisor, Major David Kim, had initially been skeptical of the young officer who'd been transferred from the prestigious Ranger program. The rumors about her rejection had followed her to Washington, painting her as someone who'd failed to meet the rigorous standards expected of elite military leaders. But within weeks, Kim found himself relying on Maria's analytical abilities to solve problems that had puzzled his department for years. "Vasquez," he said one afternoon, approaching her desk with a thick folder of shipping manifests. "We've got a situation developing in the Balkans. Our supply lines are completely screwed up, and commanders in the field are screaming about critical shortages. Think you can make sense of this mess?" Maria spread the documents across her desk, her eyes scanning transportation schedules, inventory reports, and logistical flowcharts with the intensity of a general studying battlefield positions. Within hours, she had identified the core problem: a systematic coordination failure between different military branches that was creating bottlenecks at key distribution points. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. By restructuring delivery schedules and implementing real-time communication protocols between Army, Navy, and Air Force logistics teams, she could reduce supply delivery times by 40% while cutting transportation costs by nearly $20 million annually. The plan required precise coordination across multiple time zones and the cooperation of commanders who had spent years protecting their departmental territories. Major Kim stared at the proposal with something approaching awe. "This is graduate-level strategic thinking," he murmured. "How did you figure this out in a single afternoon?" "The same principles that apply to tactical coordination work for logistics management," Maria replied quietly. "You identify the mission-critical objectives, assess available resources, and develop the most efficient path to success while building in redundancies for when things go wrong." Kim immediately forwarded the proposal to his superiors, where it quickly attracted attention from Pentagon officials responsible for military efficiency initiatives. Within days, Maria found herself presenting her logistics restructuring plan to a room full of colonels and generals who had never heard her name but were deeply impressed by the sophistication of her strategic thinking. The implementation of Operation Streamline exceeded even Maria's optimistic projections. Supply delivery times to overseas military installations improved by 47%, and the cost savings approached $30 million in the first quarter alone. Military commanders who had spent months dealing with critical shortages began receiving essential supplies ahead of schedule, dramatically improving morale and operational effectiveness in conflict zones. But the success that should have elevated Maria's career instead made her more dangerous to those who had worked to suppress her advancement. Colonel Hutchinson, now assigned to Pentagon oversight responsibilities, learned about Operation Streamline's success through official military communications. The woman he had systematically destroyed was quietly transforming military logistics from within the very department where she'd been exiled. His response was swift and calculated. Using his network of contacts throughout the Pentagon hierarchy, Hutchinson began circulating concerns about Maria's unauthorized expansion of responsibilities beyond her assigned duties. He argued that her logistics innovations, while potentially useful, represented another example of her troubling inability to work within established command structures. Lieutenant Vasquez continues to demonstrate the same pattern of independent decision-making that made her unsuitable for field command, he wrote in a confidential memo to General Morrison, who had been on the committee that rejected Maria's advancement. Her tendency to develop strategic initiatives without proper authorization suggests ongoing issues with military discipline and chain of command respect. The political machinery that had once protected incompetent leadership began working against Maria's growing reputation for excellence. Her innovations were quietly credited to Major Kim's department rather than to her individual contributions. Her name was systematically removed from official reports describing Operation Streamline's success, and requests for her promotion were buried in bureaucratic procedures that could delay advancement indefinitely. Maria watched her achievements disappear into the institutional memory of an organization that rewarded mediocrity while punishing excellence. But she had learned something crucial during her months in logistics purgatory: the Pentagon's information systems were far more vulnerable than anyone realized, and her administrative access gave her unprecedented insight into military operations around the world. Late one evening, while reviewing classified shipping manifests for routine accuracy checks, Maria discovered something that made her blood freeze. Someone with high-level security clearance was systematically diverting military supplies intended for combat zones, redirecting valuable equipment to private contractors who were selling it on international black markets. The theft operation was sophisticated, involving falsified documentation and corrupted inventory systems that made the missing supplies appear as acceptable losses due to combat damage or transportation difficulties. Millions of dollars in taxpayer-funded military equipment was being stolen while soldiers in active combat zones went without essential gear. Maria spent the weekend tracing the pattern of missing supplies, working through layers of digital security like a detective following financial evidence. What she found was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Pentagon leadership, involving officers who had the authority to authorize supply transfers without triggering standard oversight procedures. The same system that had been used to destroy her career was now being used to steal from the soldiers she had always dreamed of leading. Colonel Hutchinson's digital signature appeared on dozens of suspicious transfer authorizations, indicating his direct involvement in what amounted to systematic theft from American military forces. Maria printed the evidence and locked it in her desk drawer, uncertain about how to proceed with information that could destroy multiple careers while potentially exposing her own unauthorized access to classified systems. She had learned to survive by staying invisible, but some secrets were too dangerous to keep hidden. The ghost in the Pentagon's machinery was about to become very real and very dangerous to those who had underestimated the woman they thought they had buried forever. 5 years passed like a slow-motion siege. Maria arrived at the Pentagon before dawn each morning, reviewing logistics reports and managing supply chains, while her former classmates from Fort Liberty advanced through the ranks to major and lieutenant colonel positions. Her desk sat in a corner of the operations wing, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer terminals that had become both her fortress and her prison. The other logistics officers saw her as a dedicated but unremarkable administrator, unaware that she had once been considered the most promising tactical mind of her generation. Some Pentagon staff nodded politely when they passed her in the corridors, but most had forgotten she had ever been anything more than the quiet woman who ensured their supply requisitions were processed efficiently and accurately. Maria had become invisible by design, a ghost haunting the place where her military dreams had been systematically destroyed. But invisibility had granted her something far more valuable than recognition: complete access to the Pentagon's most sensitive logistics networks and the trust of supervisors who never questioned her dedication to maintaining operational security. Her expertise had grown far beyond what any field commander would ever need to know. She understood every procurement protocol, every transportation route, every inventory system that kept American military forces supplied around the world. Her analytical skills had evolved from tactical battlefield assessment to strategic resource management on a global scale, giving her insights into military operations that even generals rarely possessed. During lunch breaks, she would sit in her car, and watch news reports about conflicts where her former classmates were leading troops into combat. Each story reminded her of her own lost dreams, but something else had begun growing alongside the pain, a protective instinct toward the soldiers, whose lives depended on supply systems that only she truly understood. The evidence of the theft conspiracy remained locked in her desk drawer, growing larger each month as she documented new instances of diverted supplies and falsified shipping records. What had started as opportunistic pilfering had evolved into a systematic, looting operation that was stealing millions of dollars in military equipment while endangering American troops who depended on those supplies for their survival. Late one evening, while conducting routine audits of overseas shipment manifests, Maria discovered that the corruption extended far beyond simple theft. Someone was deliberately sabotaging supply deliveries to specific combat zones, creating shortages that forced military commanders to purchase replacement equipment from the same private contractors who were buying stolen Pentagon supplies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pattern was diabolical in its sophistication. Critical supplies would be diverted from their intended destinations, creating emergency shortages that required immediate procurement of replacement items at inflated prices. The contractors profiting from these emergency purchases were the same companies buying stolen military equipment through shell corporations and offshore accounts. Colonel Hutchinson had built a criminal empire that used his Pentagon position to steal from the military while simultaneously extorting money from commanders desperate to equip their troops. The same man who had destroyed Maria's career to protect his own reputation was now systematically betraying every principle of military service for personal financial gain. Maria spent weeks tracing the financial networks that connected stolen Pentagon supplies to private contractors charging inflated prices for emergency replacements. The investigation required accessing classified databases and cross-referencing shipping records with procurement authorizations, work that went far beyond her official responsibilities but was essential to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. What she discovered made her physically sick. The theft operation had directly contributed to the deaths of American soldiers who had been killed or wounded during operations where critical supplies had been diverted by Hutchinson's network. Body armor, medical supplies, and communication. Equipment that could have saved lives had instead been sold to private buyers. While troops went into combat inadequately equipped, the evidence was overwhelming. But Maria faced the same dilemma that had paralyzed her years earlier. She had no authority to investigate criminal activity, no official standing to present evidence to military prosecutors, and no protection against retaliation from officers who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy careers to protect their interests. Her unauthorized access to classified systems could be used against her if she came forward with evidence of the theft conspiracy. The same people who had buried her career for demonstrating tactical brilliance would not hesitate to court-martial her for exceeding her administrative authorities, regardless of what crime she had uncovered. But staying silent meant accepting responsibility for future casualties caused by Hutchinson's criminal network. Every day she delayed meant more stolen supplies, more inflated emergency purchases, and more American soldiers entering combat without the equipment they needed to survive. Maria began copying files to encrypted storage devices, building a comprehensive case that documented every aspect of the theft conspiracy, while protecting her own methods of investigation. She worked methodically, knowing that she would have only one opportunity to present evidence before the system closed ranks to protect itself. The transformation was complete. The promising officer who had been rejected for field command had evolved into something far more dangerous to military corruption, an invisible analyst with unprecedented access to classified information and the technical skills to trace criminal activity across multiple government agencies and international borders. Her former supervisors praised her dedication while remaining completely unaware that she was building the most comprehensive case of military corruption in Pentagon history. They saw efficiency and reliability, never suspecting that their trusted logistics administrator was preparing to bring down a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military leadership. The woman they had tried to bury was now sitting on evidence that could transform military procurement protocols forever. But first, she would need to survive the firestorm that would follow when she finally broke her years of silence. In her small apartment each night, Maria reviewed the evidence she had compiled: financial records showing millions in stolen supplies, shipping manifests documenting diverted equipment, and casualty reports listing soldiers who had died while using inadequate gear because their proper equipment had been sold to private contractors. The ghost was ready to become flesh again, and the Pentagon would never be the same. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Maria's secure phone buzzed with an emergency notification from the Pentagon's Crisis Operations Center, indicating a developing situation that required immediate logistics coordination. As the senior night shift administrator, she was responsible for managing supply requests that couldn't wait for regular business hours. The message was brief but alarming. American forces in Afghanistan were reporting critical shortages of medical supplies and ammunition during an ongoing operation in the Kandahar province. Multiple casualties were mounting while troops faced potential encirclement by enemy forces, and their requests for emergency resupply had been delayed by what appeared to be systematic coordination failures. Maria arrived at the Pentagon within 20 minutes, her mind already processing the logistical requirements for emergency supply drops to a combat zone under hostile fire. She accessed the military's real-time logistics network, expecting to find routine bureaucratic delays that could be resolved through expedited processing and priority shipping authorizations. What she found instead made her blood freeze with recognition. The supply shortages in Afghanistan weren't accidental. They were the direct result of Hutchinson's theft network systematically diverting critical military supplies that should have been pre-positioned for exactly this type of emergency situation. According to shipping records, medical supplies and ammunition intended for forward operating bases in Afghanistan had been rerouted 3 weeks earlier to what appeared to be routine inventory transfers. But Maria's unauthorized investigation had taught her to recognize the digital signatures of Hutchinson's criminal network, and the transfer authorizations bore all the hallmarks of systematic theft disguised as administrative procedure. The stolen supplies were currently sitting in a private warehouse in Dubai, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder while American soldiers died for lack of equipment that their own government had purchased but never received. The emergency procurement requests flooding her system represented desperate attempts to replace supplies that had been criminally diverted by the same officer who had destroyed her military career. Maria faced an impossible choice. Following standard emergency protocols would require hours of authorization procedures and coordination with multiple agencies, time that the soldiers in Afghanistan simply didn't have. But bypassing those protocols to expedite supply delivery would require using administrative authorities she didn't officially possess and accessing classified systems in ways that could result in court-martial proceedings. The radio communications from the combat zone grew increasingly desperate as the night progressed. Major Sarah Thompson, the commanding officer leading the endangered unit, was requesting immediate resupply while managing casualty evacuations and coordinating defensive positions against increasing enemy pressure. Her voice carried the controlled fear of someone who understood that her soldiers might not survive until dawn without the supplies that should have been available weeks ago. Pentagon Control, this is Bravo Company. Thompson's voice crackled through the communications system. We have multiple wounded requiring immediate medical attention. and our ammunition reserves are at critical levels. Request emergency resupply. Authorization for medical supplies and small arms ammunition. Time is essential. We cannot hold this position much longer without support. Maria stared at her computer screen, watching real-time intelligence feeds that showed enemy forces closing in on the American position while supply aircraft circled uselessly, waiting for authorization codes that were being delayed by bureaucratic procedures designed to prevent exactly the kind of rapid response these soldiers needed to survive. Without waiting for official permission, Maria began accessing emergency override protocols buried deep within the Pentagon's logistics networks. Her years of invisible investigation had taught her every backup system, every emergency authorization pathway, every classified access code that could expedite supply delivery in crisis situations. Her fingers moved across multiple keyboards, simultaneously authorizing priority supply drops, coordinating air transport, and establishing direct communication links with supply depot commanders who could load emergency shipments within minutes rather than hours. She was using administrative authorities that officially didn't exist, bypassing chain of command procedures that would have required approval from the same officers who were complicit in the theft. Conspiracy. The transformation was remarkable. Within 40 minutes, emergency supply aircraft were departing from 3 different military bases, carrying medical supplies and ammunition that would reach the endangered American unit before enemy forces could complete their encirclement. Maria had accomplished in less than an hour what standard procedures would have required 6 to 8 hours to achieve, but her intervention left digital fingerprints throughout the Pentagon's classified networks. Every override she had used, every authorization she had expedited, every classified system she had accessed, was logged in security databases that would eventually be reviewed by the same officers who had spent years suppressing her advancement. As dawn broke over Afghanistan, Major Thompson's voice returned to the communication networks with news that brought tears to Maria's eyes. Pentagon Control, this is Bravo Company. Emergency resupply received and casualties stabilized. Request confirmation of logistics coordinator responsible for expedited delivery. We owe them our lives. Maria remained silent, knowing that acknowledging her role would trigger investigations that could destroy what remained of her military career. But for the first time in 5 years, she felt the satisfaction of using her abilities to save American lives rather than simply managing bureaucratic procedures. The operations center was buzzing with confusion as morning shift administrators arrived to find evidence of unauthorized supply operations that had somehow succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Emergency logistics that should have taken hours had been completed in minutes, and dozens of American soldiers were alive because someone had bypassed every protocol designed to prevent rapid response. Colonel Hutchinson arrived at his Pentagon office that morning to find intelligence reports describing the successful resupply operation, unaware that the woman he had spent years trying to destroy had just saved American lives using skills she had developed while investigating his criminal conspiracy. The ghost had acted decisively when lives were at stake, but her intervention had created evidence that would soon make her impossible to ignore. The Pentagon's digital forensics team arrived at Maria's desk on a Thursday morning that felt like Judgment Day. Senior investigator Colonel James Walsh, a decorated veteran with 30 years of military intelligence experience, approached her workstation with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades unraveling complex conspiracies within government agencies. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses, "we need to discuss some irregularities in our emergency logistics protocols from earlier this week." Maria remained perfectly still, her hands folded calmly on her desk while her mind raced through possible responses. She could deny everything, claim ignorance about the emergency supply operations, and hoped that her years of invisible service would protect her from serious investigation. But the digital evidence of her intervention was undeniable, logged in. Classified systems that recorded every keystroke and authorization she had used to save American lives. Someone with extensive knowledge of our emergency protocols bypassed multiple security layers to authorize supply drops to Afghanistan. Walsh continued, studying Maria's expression for any sign of deception. The operation was successful beyond anything we've seen in recent memory, but it involved accessing classified systems without proper authorization. The investigation team had been working around the clock since the Afghanistan emergency, tracing digital signatures and analyzing system logs that revealed the scope of Maria's unauthorized intervention. What they had discovered was both impressive and deeply troubling. Evidence of someone with unprecedented access to Pentagon logistics networks who possess the technical expertise to coordinate complex military operations from within administrative systems. The emergency resupply operation saved American lives, Walsh acknowledged, his tone suggesting professional respect rather than accusation. But it also revealed vulnerabilities in our security protocols that we need to understand completely. Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of maintaining the silence that had protected her for 5 years, she chose to trust the investigation process that had once failed her so catastrophically. "I coordinated the emergency supply drops," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the busy operations center. American soldiers were dying because supplies that should have been available had been systematically diverted by a criminal conspiracy operating within Pentagon leadership. The room fell silent as Maria's admission hung in the air like a detonated explosive. Walsh leaned forward, his expression shifting from routine investigation to intense focus as he realized he was dealing with something far more significant than unauthorized computer access. "What criminal conspiracy?" he asked, his voice sharp with professional interest. For the next 4 hours, Maria presented evidence she had been compiling for years, financial records documenting millions of dollars in stolen military supplies, shipping manifests showing systematic diversion of critical equipment, and casualty reports listing American soldiers who had died while using inadequate gear because their proper equipment had been sold to private contractors. Walsh's team worked frantically to verify Maria's claims, accessing classified databases and cross-referencing procurement records with combat casualty reports. What they found exceeded their worst expectations: a systematic looting operation that had been stealing from American military forces while simultaneously extorting money from commanders desperate to equip their troops properly. "Colonel Hutchinson has been using his Pentagon position to steal military supplies and sell them to private contractors," Maria explained, her voice growing stronger as she presented evidence she had spent years collecting. "The same contractors then charge inflated prices for emergency replacement equipment, creating a cycle of theft and extortion that has directly contributed to American combat casualties." The investigation team spent the weekend expanding Maria's preliminary research, using their official authority to access financial records and international shipping databases that confirmed every aspect of her analysis. Colonel Hutchinson's theft network extended across multiple countries and involved shell corporations designed to hide the movement of stolen American military equipment. Senior investigator Walsh found himself dealing with the largest case of military corruption in Pentagon history, uncovered by a logistics administrator who had been systematically ignored by the same institution she had spent years protecting. The evidence was overwhelming, but the political implications were staggering. Dozens of high-ranking officers would face criminal charges, and the scandal would reshape public trust in military leadership. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Walsh asked during one of their extended interview sessions. Maria's response carried the weight of 5 years of institutional betrayal. "Because the same people who destroyed my career for demonstrating tactical excellence are the ones who would have buried this evidence to protect their reputations. I needed to build a case so comprehensive that it couldn't be dismissed or covered up. As news of the investigation spread through Pentagon corridors, Maria found herself at the center of a media storm that she had never wanted. Reporters began calling constantly, demanding interviews about the woman who had uncovered the largest military corruption scandal in decades. Pentagon officials who had ignored her for years suddenly wanted to schedule meetings and discuss her extraordinary analytical capabilities. But the most significant moment came when Major Sarah Thompson, the officer whose unit Maria had saved during the Afghanistan emergency, requested permission to meet the logistics coordinator who had risked her career to ensure her soldiers received life-saving supplies. "Ma'am," Thompson said, her voice thick with emotion during their brief encounter, "you saved my soldiers' lives, but more than that, you've shown us what real military service looks like. Not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that serves in silence when lives are at stake." The investigation had become something much larger than simple corruption charges. It had exposed fundamental flaws in military culture that prioritized institutional protection over individual excellence, and Maria Vasquez had become the focal point of a national conversation about integrity, accountability, and the price of speaking truth to power. The woman who had been buried in administrative obscurity was about to become impossible to ignore, and the Pentagon would never be the same. The sealed evidence room in the Pentagon's basement hadn't been opened since Maria's original career destruction 5 years earlier. When senior investigator Walsh personally broke the security seals, the original files from her Fort Liberty evaluation sat on metal shelving, like time bombs waiting to explode decades of institutional lies. The first document Walsh examined was the official incident report that had been used to justify Maria's rejection from field command. According to the carefully crafted narrative, Lieutenant Vasquez had demonstrated dangerous independent thinking and inability to follow established protocols during tactical exercises that required strict adherence to chain-of-command procedures. But buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language was a second file that made Walsh's blood pressure spike with recognition. The real evaluation report, complete with witness statements and performance assessments that painted an entirely different picture of Maria's capabilities and character. During her time at Fort Liberty, Captain Rebecca Martinez, who had served as Maria's tactical training supervisor, had written a glowing assessment that contradicted every element of the official narrative. Lieutenant Vasquez demonstrates exceptional strategic thinking and natural leadership abilities that surpass anything I've observed in 15 years of military instruction. Her tactical innovations have improved training outcomes across multiple units, and her ability to inspire confidence among subordinates represents the future of American military leadership. The testimony continued for pages, describing specific instances where Maria's quick thinking had prevented training accidents, her innovations that had improved unit effectiveness, and her consistent demonstration of the exact qualities that military leadership claimed to value most highly. Every instructor who had worked with her directly praised her professionalism, dedication, and extraordinary potential for field command. Walsh's investigative team worked through the night, cross-referencing the buried positive evaluations with the official rejection documents that had destroyed Maria's career. What they discovered was a systematic rewriting of history designed to protect Colonel Hutchinson's reputation while eliminating a subordinate whose excellence made his own mediocrity embarrassingly obvious. The most damning evidence emerged from Hutchinson's private correspondence, recovered from archived email servers that he had assumed were permanently deleted. In messages to other senior officers, he had explicitly discussed the need to manage the Vasquez situation before her tactical brilliance attracted too much attention from Pentagon leadership. "The woman is too smart for her own good," he had written to General Morrison just weeks before Maria's evaluation. "If she continues advancing at this rate, she'll be outranking people with decades more experience within 5 years. We need officers who understand their place in the hierarchy, not ones who think they can revolutionize military doctrine. The corruption investigation had uncovered something far more insidious than simple theft: a systematic campaign to suppress military excellence in order to protect the careers of mediocre officers who felt threatened by subordinates with superior capabilities. Maria hadn't been rejected for lacking judgment, she had been rejected for possessing too much of it. Financial records revealed that Hutchinson's criminal network had been operating for over a decade, systematically stealing military supplies while using his Pentagon position to eliminate potential whistleblowers who might threaten the conspiracy. Maria's rejection from field command had been part of a broader pattern of removing competent officers who possessed the analytical skills to recognize and report corruption. The investigation team discovered evidence of at least 12 other promising officers whose careers had been deliberately sabotaged over the past decade, each one targeted for elimination after demonstrating the kind of independent thinking and moral courage that could threaten established corruption networks. The Pentagon had been systematically purging its most capable leaders, while promoting officers whose primary qualification was their willingness to protect institutional secrets. When Colonel Hutchinson was finally confronted with the evidence, his carefully maintained facade of military professionalism crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The man who had built his career on institutional authority sat in the same conference room where he had orchestrated Maria's destruction, surrounded by proof of his criminal conspiracy and moral bankruptcy. She was going to destroy everything, he admitted during recorded testimony, his voice hollow with defeat. The board felt that someone with her capabilities would eventually discover our financial arrangements and report them to military prosecutors. We couldn't allow that kind of disruption to established operations. The truth was breathtaking in its cynicism. Maria hadn't been rejected for poor performance. She had been targeted for elimination because her integrity and analytical abilities posed an existential threat to a criminal conspiracy that had been looting American military resources for years. Her exceptional qualifications had been seen as dangerous weapons that could destroy the very corruption that Hutchinson's network depended on for their financial survival. Meanwhile, the officers who had been promoted in her place were specifically chosen for their mediocrity and moral flexibility. They lacked the competence to recognize systematic theft and the courage to report it, even if they suspected criminal activity. The Pentagon had been deliberately elevating incompetent leadership while destroying officers whose excellence could threaten institutional corruption. The media explosion that followed was unlike anything in Pentagon history. Maria found herself at the center of a national scandal that extended far beyond simple corruption charges into fundamental questions about military culture, institutional accountability, and the price of excellence in hierarchical organizations that prioritize conformity over competence. Congressional investigators demanded hearings about the systematic suppression of military talent. Defense contractors faced federal investigations about their roles in purchasing stolen equipment. International allies questioned their confidence in American military leadership structures that had been compromised by criminal conspiracies operating at the highest levels. But perhaps the most significant revelation came from combat veterans, who began speaking publicly about equipment failures and supply shortages that had cost American lives over the past decade. The theft conspiracy hadn't just stolen money, it had directly contributed to combat casualties by diverting critical supplies that soldiers needed to survive in hostile environments. The woman who had been silenced for 5 years was about to speak with a voice that would reshape American military culture forever. The Pentagon's Grand Assembly Hall had never hosted a ceremony quite like this one. Maria stood at attention in her dress uniform, newly adorned with the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel, a rank that should have been hers years earlier. If institutional corruption hadn't derailed her career trajectory, The promotion ceremony was being broadcast live to military installations around the world, watched by thousands of service members who had followed her story with intense personal interest. Defense Secretary Robert Chun stepped to the podium, his expression carrying the weight of someone addressing one of the most significant military scandals in American history. Behind him sat a panel of the Pentagon's highest-ranking officials, including several generals who had been brought in to oversee the complete restructuring of military procurement and personnel evaluation systems. Today we gather not just to correct an injustice, Secretary Chun began, his voice echoing through the packed auditorium, but to acknowledge that our institution failed one of its most promising leaders through systematic corruption that threatened the very foundations of American military excellence. The investigation's final report had been released the previous week, documenting a conspiracy that extended far beyond Colonel Hutchinson's theft network into fundamental problems with military culture and leadership accountability. The Pentagon's own internal review had concluded that Maria Vasquez represented exactly the kind of innovative, principled leadership that the military needed to face 21st century challenges. Congressional investigators had discovered that the suppression of military talent wasn't limited to Maria's case. Over the past 15 years, dozens of exceptional officers had been systematically eliminated from advancement tracks because their competence and integrity threatened established corruption networks. The Pentagon had been deliberately promoting mediocrity while destroying the careers of its most capable leaders. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, Secretary Chun continued, your dedication to protecting American lives, even while your own career was being systematically destroyed, represents the highest traditions of military service. Your willingness to sacrifice personal advancement in order to serve your country demonstrates the moral courage that should define American military leadership. The ceremony included representatives from every military branch acknowledging that the corruption investigation had revealed systematic problems across all services. Maria's case had become a catalyst for the most comprehensive military reform initiative since the Goldwater-Nichols Act, with new oversight mechanisms designed to protect whistleblowers and eliminate the kind of institutional retaliation she had experienced. But the most meaningful moment came when Major Sarah Thompson approached the podium to present Maria with a commendation on behalf of the soldiers whose lives she had saved during the Afghanistan emergency. Thompson's voice carried the emotional weight of someone who understood that military service sometimes required protecting others from the very institution you serve. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez demonstrated that true military leadership isn't about following orders blindly, Thompson said, her words carrying across the silent auditorium. It's about having the moral courage to do what's right, even when doing so puts your own career at risk. She saved American lives by refusing to let bureaucratic corruption triumph over military necessity. The awards ceremony continued for nearly an hour, with Maria receiving commendations from military organizations, veterans groups, and international allies who praised her role in exposing corruption that had compromised American military effectiveness. But she remained characteristically humble throughout the proceedings, deflecting praise toward the investigation team and the soldiers whose safety had motivated her. Years of silent service. The financial settlement offered by the Pentagon was substantial compensation for 5 years of suppressed advancement, damages for the deliberate destruction of her career, and recognition of the monetary value of her innovations in military logistics. Defense contractors who had participated in the theft conspiracy faced billions in penalties, with much of that money designated for improved military equipment and enhanced veteran support services. Major news networks requested exclusive interviews about her transformation from rejected officer to vindicated hero. Publishers offered lucrative book deals for her story of institutional corruption and personal resilience. Speaking bureaus wanted to schedule her for conferences about leadership, integrity, and organizational accountability across corporate and government sectors. But Maria declined most of these opportunities, choosing instead to focus on the military reform initiatives that her case had inspired. She accepted appointment to a Pentagon task force responsible for implementing new oversight protocols and eliminating the cultural factors that had enabled systematic corruption to flourish for so many years. Her first official act in this new role was establishing a confidential reporting system that would protect military personnel who identified corruption, waste, or safety violations within their units. The Vasquez Protocol created independent investigation pathways that bypassed traditional chain-of-command structures, ensuring that future whistleblowers wouldn't face the kind of institutional retaliation that had nearly destroyed her career. Reform initiative extended beyond corruption prevention into fundamental changes in military promotion and evaluation systems. New criteria emphasized innovation, independent thinking, and moral courage, exactly the qualities that had made Maria threatening to corrupt leadership but essential for effective military operations in complex modern conflicts. International military academies began incorporating her case into their ethics curricula, using her story to illustrate the importance of protecting institutional integrity, even when doing so requires challenging established authority. NATO allies implemented similar whistleblower protection protocols, recognizing that military effectiveness depended on eliminating the fear that prevented talented officers from reporting systematic problems. Perhaps most importantly, the Pentagon established new fast-track promotion procedures for officers whose careers had been damaged by participating in corruption investigations. The institutional barriers that had kept Maria buried in administrative roles for 5 years were systematically dismantled, replaced by systems that rewarded moral courage rather than punishing it. The evening news that night featured footage of Maria leaving the Pentagon after her vindication ceremony, walking past the same security checkpoints where she had entered as an unknown logistics administrator 5 years earlier. But now she carried the authority and respect that her talents had always deserved, along with the knowledge that her suffering had created lasting changes that would protect future generations of military leaders. The woman who had been told she would never make colonel was about to begin a journey that would ultimately lead her to wear 5 stars and transform American military culture in the process. 10 years after her vindication, Colonel Maria Vasquez stood in the Pentagon Situation Room as the youngest officer ever invited to participate in National Security Council briefings. The same institution that had once tried to bury her potential now relied on her strategic insights for some of America's most critical military decisions. Her transformation from silenced whistleblower to indispensable strategic advisor had been swift and decisive, driven by a combination of exceptional capability and the institutional reforms her case had inspired. The Vasquez Protocol had revolutionized military culture in ways that extended far beyond corruption prevention. Young officers who might have once remained silent about systematic problems now felt empowered to report inefficiencies, safety violations, and strategic miscalculations without fear of career retaliation. The military had become more adaptive, more innovative, and significantly more effective at identifying and solving complex operational challenges. Maria's role in this transformation extended beyond symbolic importance into practical leadership that was reshaping American military doctrine. Her appointment as Director of Strategic Innovation had given her authority to implement tactical and logistical improvements across all service branches, position that allowed her to apply the analytical skills that had once made her threatening to corrupt leadership. The conflicts in Eastern Europe and the South China Sea had created new challenges that required exactly the kind of independent thinking and rapid adaptation that Maria represented. Traditional military hierarchies struggled with the complexity of modern warfare, where cyber attacks, economic sanctions, and asymmetric threats required innovative responses that couldn't be found in established doctrine manuals. General Patricia Williams, who had replaced the disgraced leadership structure that Maria's investigation had exposed, relied heavily on her strategic assessments for planning American responses to international crises. Vasquez thinks 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room, Williams often told Pentagon colleagues. She sees patterns and connections that others miss, and her recommendations consistently prove correct, even when they contradict conventional wisdom. Maria's promotion to brigadier general came with assignment to lead the Pentagon's newly created Adaptive Strategy Division, a unit specifically designed to develop military responses to unprecedented challenges that traditional planning methodologies couldn't address effectively. Her team included the military's most innovative thinkers, many of whom had been identified and promoted through reform initiatives that her case had inspired. The division's first major test came during a complex international crisis involving simultaneous cyber attacks on American infrastructure, naval confrontations in international waters, and terrorist threats against civilian populations. The situation required coordinating responses across multiple government agencies while managing diplomatic relationships with allies who had different strategic priorities and domestic political constraints. Maria's approach demonstrated the analytical brilliance that had been recognized at Fort Liberty decades earlier, but now applied to strategic challenges of unprecedented complexity. She developed a multi-layered response strategy that addressed immediate security threats while building long-term diplomatic solutions and economic deterrence that would prevent similar crises from developing in the future. The operation's success exceeded even optimistic projections. Cyber threats were neutralized through innovative defensive protocols that Maria's team had developed by studying corporate cybersecurity innovations and adapting them for military applications. Naval confrontations were de-escalated through strategic positioning that demonstrated American strength while providing face-saving opportunities for potential adversaries to withdraw without appearing defeated. Most importantly, the terrorist threats were eliminated through intelligence cooperation initiatives that Maria had designed to share information between international agencies while protecting each nation's sensitive operational capabilities. Her understanding of institutional psychology, developed through years of navigating Pentagon bureaucracy, proved invaluable for managing complex relationships between organizations with competing priorities. The international recognition that followed established Maria as one of the world's preeminent strategic thinkers. NATO allies requested her participation in planning committees for European security initiatives. Asian partners sought her insights for managing regional tensions with authoritarian regimes. Even traditional adversaries began including references to her strategic assessments in their own military planning documents. Recognizing the sophistication of her analytical approaches, her promotion to Major General came with assignment as Deputy Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, a position that gave her direct responsibility for coordinating America's nuclear deterrent capabilities and space-based defense systems. The appointment represented unprecedented trust in an officer whose career had been systematically destroyed just 15 years earlier for demonstrating exactly the kind of independent thinking that these responsibilities required. But Maria's greatest achievement during this period wasn't military, it was educational. She established the Vasquez Institute for Military Innovation at the National Defense University, creating an academic program specifically designed to develop the kind of adaptive strategic thinking that modern warfare required. The institute attracted the military's most promising young officers, many of whom would go on to lead the next generation of American military operations. The curriculum emphasized ethical decision-making, institutional accountability, and the moral courage required to challenge established procedures when circumstances demanded innovative responses. Students studied her case not as an example of institutional failure, but as a demonstration of how individual integrity could transform entire Organizational cultures, when combined with persistence and strategic thinking. International military academies began sending their most promising officers to study at the Vasquez Institute, recognizing that the strategic methodologies being developed there represented the future of military leadership in an increasingly complex global environment. The woman who had once been considered too dangerous to promote was now training the officers who would shape international security for the next several decades. Corporate leaders and government officials from non-military agencies also sought training at the Institute, understanding that the strategic thinking methodologies Maria had developed could be applied to challenges far beyond traditional military applications. Her approach to analyzing complex systems and developing adaptive responses proved valuable for everything from pandemic response planning to climate change adaptation strategies. The transformation was complete. The officer who had been buried in Pentagon logistics for 5 years was now shaping global strategic thinking and training the leaders who would implement her innovations across multiple continents and conflict zones. But her greatest challenges and her ultimate destiny as America's first 5-star general still lay ahead. 25 years after Colonel Hutchinson had told her she would never make colonel, Lieutenant General Maria Vasquez found herself facing the greatest military crisis since World War II. The Situation Room in the White House basement buzzed with tension as intelligence reports painted an increasingly dire picture. A coordinated attack by multiple adversaries had crippled critical American infrastructure while simultaneously threatening allies across 3 continents. The complexity of the crisis exceeded anything in modern military history. Cyber attacks had disabled power grids across the eastern seaboard, while enemy submarines positioned themselves near vital shipping lanes. Terrorist cells activated in major European cities, while authoritarian regimes launched coordinated disinformation campaigns designed to undermine NATO unity and American leadership credibility. President Sara Martinez looked across the table at the assembled military leadership, her expression reflecting the weight of decisions that could determine the survival of democratic institutions worldwide. "General Vasquez," she said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of briefing reports and strategic assessments. "I need to know if we can coordinate an effective response to simultaneous threats on this scale." Maria studied the digital displays showing real-time intelligence from around the world, her mind processing the interconnected nature of attacks that had been designed to overwhelm traditional military response capabilities. This wasn't random terrorism or conventional warfare. It was a sophisticated attempt to exploit the gaps between different government agencies and international allies that had never been required to coordinate responses to multi-domain threats of this magnitude. "Madame President," Maria replied, her voice carrying the calm authority that had become her trademark during 3 decades of military service. "This crisis requires abandoning traditional command structures in favor of adaptive coordination that can respond faster than our adversaries can adjust their strategies." The plan she presented over the next 4 hours demonstrated strategic thinking that exceeded anything in American military doctrine. Rather than treating each threat as a separate problem requiring individual solutions, Maria proposed an integrated response that would use the interconnected nature of the attacks against the adversaries who had launched them. Her strategy involved using cyber defense capabilities to not just restore American infrastructure, but to trace the digital pathways back to their sources and launch counterattacks that would disable enemy coordination systems. Naval forces would respond to submarine threats by implementing blockade procedures that would strangle the economic resources funding the entire coordinated assault. Most innovatively, Maria recommended using the terrorist attacks in European cities as opportunities to demonstrate American commitment to alliance relationships while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the broader conspiracy that connected all these seemingly separate threats. Rather than simply responding defensively, her plan would transform each attack into a strategic advantage for the United States and its allies. The implementation required coordination between agencies that had never worked together effectively. Alliance relationships that had been strained by recent political tensions, and technologies that had never been tested under combat conditions. Maria found herself essentially conducting the global orchestra of military, intelligence, diplomatic, and economic resources while enemy forces adapted their strategies in real time. The first phase of the response succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Cyber counterattacks not only restored American infrastructure but provided unprecedented insight into enemy command structures that had been hidden for years. Naval operations eliminated submarine threats while capturing intelligence assets that revealed the financial networks funding the entire coordinated assault. But the most significant breakthrough came through Maria's coordination with European allies during the terrorist crisis response. Rather than simply preventing attacks, her integrated intelligence sharing protocols allowed coalition forces to identify and neutralize the entire terrorist network, while simultaneously exposing the state sponsors who had been using these groups as proxy forces. Within 72 hours, what had appeared to be an existential threat to American security had been transformed into the most comprehensive intelligence victory in modern history. Enemy command structures had been exposed, financial networks had been dismantled, and alliance relationships had been strengthened through shared success against common threats. The international recognition that followed was unprecedented. NATO allies credited Maria's strategic coordination with preventing what could have been the collapse of the Western security architecture. Asian partners requested permanent integration of her strategic methodologies into regional defense planning. Even neutral nations began seeking security cooperation, agreements based on the innovative approaches she had demonstrated during the crisis. President Martinez addressed the nation 3 days after the crisis resolution, standing before a joint session of Congress that included representatives from allied nations who had participated in the coordinated response. The American people, and indeed the entire free world, owe a debt of gratitude to Lieutenant General Vasquez. She announced to sustained applause that echoed through the Capitol building. Her strategic vision and operational brilliance didn't just protect our nation, they demonstrated that democratic institutions and alliance relationships remained the most powerful forces for global stability. When led by individuals with the moral courage and intellectual capability that General Vasquez represents. The recommendation for her promotion to 4-star general came not just from American military leadership, but from a coalition of international allies who argued that her strategic capabilities represented a global asset that required appropriate recognition and authority. The confirmation process was the fastest in Senate history, with bipartisan support that reflected universal recognition of her extraordinary contributions to national and international security. But even as she accepted her 4th star, Maria understood that the greatest challenges of her career still lay ahead. The crisis she had just resolved had revealed vulnerabilities in global security architecture that would require fundamental restructuring of international military cooperation. The strategic thinking that had saved democratic institutions during this crisis would need to be institutionalized to prevent future threats from overwhelming the systems she had protected. The woman who had been told she would never make colonel was about to become the first person in American history to earn a 5th star since World War II, and her greatest contributions to global security were still to come. 30 years to the day after Colonel Hutchinson had destroyed her dreams at Fort Liberty, General Maria Vasquez stood before the largest gathering of international military leaders in history. The ceremony was taking place not in the Pentagon, but in the newly constructed Global Security Command Center in Geneva, facility that existed because of the international cooperation frameworks she had designed during the crisis that had nearly shattered the world order. President Martinez stepped forward with a small velvet box that contained something no American had worn since General MacArthur. 5 silver stars that would make Maria the first person to achieve this rank in over 70 years, and the first woman in American history to command all branches of the military simultaneously. 30 years ago, the president began, her voice carrying across an audience that included heads of state, military commanders from 57 nations, and representatives from every major international security organization. A young lieutenant was told she lacked the judgment and leadership qualities necessary for military advancement. Today, we gather to recognize that same woman as the architect of the most comprehensive transformation in global security since the founding of NATO. The path to this moment had been unprecedented in its scope and significance. Following the crisis that had established her reputation as the world's preeminent strategic thinker, Maria had been appointed as the first Supreme Commander of Allied Global Security, a position that gave her coordinating authority over military forces from democratic nations across every continent. The role required capabilities that transcended traditional military leadership. She wasn't just commanding American forces, but orchestrating defense cooperation between nations with different languages, cultures, political systems, and strategic priorities. The alliance structure she had designed allowed 37 countries to share intelligence, coordinate responses to emerging threats, and maintain collective security without sacrificing individual national sovereignty. Her innovations had revolutionized how democratic nations approached international security challenges. The Global Threat Assessment Network she had established could identify and neutralize emerging crises before they reached the scale of coordinated attacks that had once threatened civilization itself. Cyber threats, economic warfare, disinformation campaigns, and terrorist activities were now addressed through integrated responses that made such tactics ineffective against united, democratic resistance. But perhaps her greatest achievement was educational. The Vasquez Doctrine, taught at military academies worldwide, emphasized adaptive leadership that could function effectively across cultural boundaries while maintaining ethical standards that preserved democratic values. Officers trained in her methodologies were serving in leadership positions throughout the international community, creating a generation of military leaders who understood that modern security required cooperation rather than competition between allied nations. Ceremony included representatives from every nation that had benefited from her strategic leadership. NATO allies credited her coordination frameworks with preventing multiple potential conflicts in Eastern Europe. Pacific partners praised her regional security initiatives that had maintained stability despite increasing authoritarian aggression. African nations spoke about development, security programs that had addressed the root causes of regional instability while respecting national independence and cultural autonomy. General Chun Wei, representing the reformed Chinese military leadership that had emerged after the crisis 30 years earlier, stepped forward to address the assembly. General Vasquez demonstrated that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into partners. He said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had personally witnessed her diplomatic and strategic capabilities. Her approach to international security showed us that cooperation serves every nation's interests more effectively than competition, and that shared prosperity creates more stable peace than military deterrence alone. The testimonials continued for over an hour, with military leaders from every continent describing how Maria's innovations had improved their capabilities while strengthening international relationships. Her strategic thinking had become the foundation for a new approach to global security that emphasized prevention over reaction, cooperation over confrontation, and adaptive problem-solving over rigid adherence to outdated doctrines. But the most meaningful moment came when Major General Jennifer Chun, the granddaughter of Maria's original roommate at Fort Liberty approached the podium to present a letter from the surviving members of Maria's original Ranger class. Many of them had gone on to distinguished military careers of their own, but all acknowledged that her example had shown them what true leadership looked like during the darkest moment of her persecution. 30 years ago, you showed us that integrity matters more than advancement, and that serving others is more important than protecting yourself. Chun read from the letter. You taught us that real leaders don't abandon their principles when institutions fail them. They work to transform those institutions into something worthy of the people they're supposed to serve. As President Martinez placed the 5th star on Maria's uniform, she spoke words that would be remembered by military historians for generations. This rank recognizes not just exceptional military achievement, but the transformation of global security architecture through strategic vision, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to democratic values. The woman who had been deemed unfit for command had become the most trusted military leader in the free world. Her innovations in international cooperation had prevented conflicts that could have cost millions of lives. Her educational initiatives were training the next generation of leaders who would face challenges that couldn't yet be imagined. In her acceptance speech, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from a Pentagon logistics cubicle to the pinnacle of international military leadership. 30 years ago, I learned that injustice is temporary, but the work we do to prevent others from experiencing that injustice can be permanent, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become legendary among international allies. Every young officer who reports corruption without fear, every military leader who chooses cooperation over competition, every nation that seeks security through partnership rather than domination, they represent the true victory over the forces that once tried to silence truth and suppress excellence. The 5 stars on her uniform represented more than personal vindication. They symbolized the triumph of integrity over corruption, innovation over tradition, and justice over institutional protection. The woman they had tried to bury had not just survived. She had transformed the very concept of military leadership for the entire democratic world. As the ceremony concluded, Maria looked out at an audience that included young officers from every allied nation, knowing that her greatest achievement wasn't the rank she had earned, but the institution she had built to ensure that merit, integrity, and excellence would never again be suppressed by those who feared accountability. The 5-star general who had once been told she would never make colonel had proved that truth. Like steel under pressure, only grows stronger when tested by adversity. Her legacy would protect democratic values long after the stars on her uniform had turned to memory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.